I was standing in my kitchen, hands trembling as I carved the turkey I'd spent all morning preparing, when my son's wife looked me straight in the eye and said, "You'll just ruin the holiday like always." The words hit me like a slap across the face. 25 years of hosting Thanksgiving dinner, 25 years of getting up at dawn to bake pies and stuff the turkey, 25 years of setting my grandmother's china just right, and this is what I got. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. I just stood there, carving knife in hand, watching my carefully planned holiday crumble around me. But what happened next changed everything. And I'm about to tell you exactly how one moment of cruelty became the catalyst for the strongest decision I've ever made. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Linda, and I'm 62 years old. I've lived in the same house on Elmwood Drive in Maple Ridge, Ohio for 37 years. It's a modest 2-story home with white shutters and a wraparound porch that my husband Robert and I bought when Marcus was just a baby. The walls are covered with family photos spanning decades, school pictures, graduation shots, wedding photos, all the milestones that make a house a home. I've always been the type of woman who finds joy in the simple things, baking cookies for the church fundraiser, tending to my small garden out back, hosting family dinners where everyone gathers around our old oak dining table. For as long as I can remember, holidays have been my specialty, my way of showing love to the people who matter most. That particular Thanksgiving morning started like every other for the past quarter century. I woke up at 5:30, tied my hair back in a ponytail, and padded downstairs in my slippers to begin what had become a sacred ritual. The kitchen was still dark, quiet, filled with the faint scent of cinnamon from the apple pie I'd baked the night before. I switched on the overhead light and surveyed my domain. Ingredients lined the counters in perfect order, my grandmother's recipe cards laid out like a roadmap to holiday perfection. The 20-pound turkey sat ready in its roasting pan, surrounded by vegetables I'd chopped the evening before. Everything was exactly as it should be. I'd been looking forward to this day for weeks, maybe more than usual. The past few months had been challenging for our family. Robert had been dealing with some heart issues that kept us both awake at night, and I'd been struggling with my own health concerns. Nothing serious, but enough to make me feel more fragile than I cared to admit. The doctors had found some irregularities in my blood work that required monitoring, and though they assured me it was likely nothing, the uncertainty had settled into my bones like a persistent ache. In times like these, I found comfort in tradition, in the familiar rhythms of family gatherings and shared meals. Marcus, my son, had always been the light of my life. At 31, he was kind-hearted and thoughtful, the type of man who still called his mother twice a week just to check in. He worked as an accountant at a firm downtown, steady and reliable like his father. 3 years ago, he'd met Brittany at a friend's wedding, and within 6 months, they were engaged. I remember the day he brought her home to meet us. How nervous he was, how much he wanted us to love her. Brittany was undeniably beautiful, with long blonde hair and the kind of confidence that filled a room. She worked in marketing for a tech company, drove a sleek black BMW, and carried herself with an assurance I sometimes envied. From the beginning, I tried my best to welcome her into our family. I invited her to our weekly family dinners, asked about her work, her interests, her childhood. But there was something in the way she looked at our home, at our traditions, at me, that made me feel small and outdated. She never said anything directly critical, but there were subtle comments, little observations that felt like pinpricks. She'd mention how her mother always hired caterers for holidays, how much easier it must be than doing everything yourself. She'd suggest modern alternatives to dishes I'd been making for decades, always with a sweet smile that somehow made the criticism sting more. When they got married, I hoped things would improve. I thought maybe once she officially became part of the family, she'd begin to appreciate what we had built together. I offered to teach her my recipes, to share the stories behind our holiday traditions. She always declined politely, claiming she was too busy with work, too tired from their social commitments. I told myself it didn't matter, that she'd come around eventually, that love and patience would win in the end. This Thanksgiving was supposed to be special. It would be our 4th holiday together as an extended family, and I'd planned everything, with extra care. I'd spent weeks preparing, not just the meal but the entire experience. I'd brought down the good china from the top shelf, the set my mother had given me when I got married. I'd polished the silver candlesticks and pressed the linen tablecloth that only came out for the most important occasions. The dining room looked like something from a magazine, warm and inviting, every detail carefully considered. Emma, my daughter, had driven in from Columbus the night before, bringing her usual energy and laughter to fill the house. At 28, she was everything I could have hoped for in a daughter, compassionate and funny, with Robert's practical nature and my nurturing instincts. She'd been helping me prep for days, chopping vegetables, mixing pie fillings, sharing stories about her job as a pediatric nurse. Having her home always made everything feel complete, like all the pieces of our family puzzle had clicked into place. As the morning progressed, the house began to fill with the aromas that defined Thanksgiving in our home. The turkey was browning beautifully in the oven, the stuffing bubbling around its edges. I'd made my famous green bean casserole, the one with the crispy onions on top that everyone raved about, and the sweet potato dish that had been passed down through 3 generations of women in my family. The pumpkin pies were cooling on the counter, their crusts golden and perfect, waiting for the dollop of fresh whipped cream I'd make just before serving. Robert wandered into the kitchen around 10, still in his pajamas, drawn by the smell of coffee and bacon. At 65, he was still handsome in that weathered, dependable way that had attracted me all those years ago. His hair had gone completely gray, but his eyes were still the same warm brown that had made me fall in love with him when we were barely out of high school. He wrapped his arms around my waist from behind as I stirred the gravy, kissing the top of my head in a gesture so familiar it was like breathing. "Smells incredible in here," he murmured, reaching around me to steal a piece of bacon from the plate beside the stove. "You've outdone yourself again, Linda." I leaned back against his chest, allowing myself a moment of contentment. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This was what I lived for. These simple moments of domestic happiness. The knowledge that I was creating something meaningful for the people I loved. "I just want everything to be perfect," I said. Though even as the words left my mouth, I wondered why I always felt the need to strive for an impossible standard. Emma appeared in the doorway, still in her robe, her dark hair messy from sleep. She looked so much like I had at her age, with the same heart-shaped face and expressive eyes. "Mom, you need to take a break," she said, concern evident in her voice. "You've been going non-stop since dawn. Sit down and let me help." But I couldn't sit still. Not today. There was too much to do, too many details to coordinate. The table needed to be set, the wine needed to be chilled, the rolls needed to go in the oven at exactly the right time. I'd been orchestrating Thanksgiving, dinner for so long that it had become second nature, a complex dance of timing and preparation that I could perform in my sleep. Emma knew better than to argue with me when I was in full hostess mode, so she contented herself with setting out coffee cups and stealing tastes of everything when she thought I wasn't looking. Marcus and Brittany were expected at 2 o'clock, along with Sarah, my neighbor and closest friend, who'd been joining us for holidays ever since her husband passed away 5 years ago. I'd been looking forward to seeing Sarah almost as much as having the whole family together. She was one of those rare friends who'd known me long enough to love me exactly as I was, flaws and all. At 60, she was still vibrant and sharp-tongued, with a laugh that could fill a room and the kind of wisdom that only comes from living through both joy and heartbreak. By noon, everything was under control. The turkey was resting, covered in foil. The side dishes were warming in the oven, and the dining room table looked like a spread from a holiday magazine. I'd changed into my favorite dress, a deep burgundy, wool that Robert had bought me for Christmas the year before, and put on the pearl earrings that had been my mother's. Looking in the hallway mirror, I felt a surge of pride. Despite the challenges of the past few months, despite the subtle tensions that seemed to follow every family gathering lately, I had created something beautiful. Sarah arrived first, as she always did, carrying a bottle of wine and a store-bought apple pie that she presented with mock ceremony. "I know it's not homemade," she said with a grin, "but I figured you had enough on your plate." She was wearing a bright orange sweater that clashed wonderfully with her silver hair, and her eyes sparkled with the mischief that had made her my favorite person to gossip with over coffee for the past 20 years. "You didn't need to bring anything," I protested, though I was secretly grateful for the backup dessert. There was something comforting about having Sarah there, someone who understood the unspoken pressures of maintaining family harmony, someone who'd witnessed all the small dramas and victories that made up a life lived in service to others. "How are you holding up?" she asked quietly, her voice taking on the concerned tone she reserved for our more serious conversations. She knew about Robert's heart issues, about my own health concerns, about the growing tension I'd been feeling around family gatherings. Sarah had a way of seeing through the cheerful facade I maintained for everyone else. "I'm fine," I said automatically, the response I'd perfected over months of well-meaning inquiries. "Everything's under control." She gave me the look that said she didn't believe me for a second, but before she could press further, we heard car doors slamming in the driveway. Marcus and Brittany had arrived. I smoothed my dress, checked my lipstick in the hallway mirror one more time, and opened the front door with what I hoped was the perfect welcoming smile. Marcus bounded up the front steps like he always did, still my little boy despite being taller than his father and old enough to have a mortgage. He swept me into a hug that lifted me off my feet, spinning me around on the porch while I laughed and protested that he'd wrinkle my dress. This was the Marcus I remembered, the one who'd spent countless afternoons at this same kitchen table, helping me roll out pie crusts and sneaking cookie dough when he thought I wasn't watching. Brittany followed more slowly, picking her way, carefully up the steps in heels that seemed impractical for a family dinner. She was wearing a white cashmere sweater and dark jeans that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a year, her hair perfectly styled despite the November wind. She offered her cheek for the obligatory air kiss, her smile bright but somehow distant, like she was already thinking about being somewhere else. "Linda, the house looks lovely," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that I'd learned to recognize, the one that sounded like a compliment but felt like an assessment. So traditional. I thanked her, choosing to take her words at face value, though something in her inflection made me second-guess the wisdom of using my grandmother's china. Maybe it did look old-fashioned compared to the sleek, minimalist aesthetic that seemed to define Brittany's world. Maybe the carefully coordinated fall decorations I'd spent hours arranging looked quaint and provincial to someone who was used to professionally designed spaces. We gathered in the living room while I put the finishing touches on dinner, the conversation flowing around topics I'd heard a dozen times before. Marcus's work, Brittany's latest project, the vacation they were planning for the holidays. I moved between the kitchen and the dining room, making sure everything was perfect, that every dish was properly warmed, that the wine glasses were filled to just the right level. Finally, it was time. I called everyone to the table, my heart swelling, with pride as they took in the spread I'd created. The turkey, golden and magnificent, held the place of honor at the head of the table. The side dishes were arranged around it like a harvest altar, each one representing hours of preparation and decades of tradition. The candlelight flickered across the polished silverware, creating exactly the warm, festive atmosphere I'd envisioned. Robert offered the blessing, his voice warm and steady, as he thanked God for family, for health, for the blessings of another year together. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, overwhelmed by gratitude for this moment, for these people, gathered around my table, for the simple privilege of being able to create this experience for the ones I loved. We began passing dishes, filling plates, settling into the comfortable rhythm of a family meal. The conversation was lighter than usual, filled with laughter and good-natured teasing. Emma regaled us with stories from the hospital. Robert shared updates on his latest woodworking project, and even Brittany seemed more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. For a brief, shining moment, everything felt exactly as it should. I had just stood to carve the turkey, the carving knife steady in my hands as I prepared to slice the first perfect piece, when Brittany's voice cut through the warm chatter like a blade. I looked up, expecting to see her smiling face, perhaps offering to help or complimenting the meal. Instead, I found her staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Her lips curved in what might have been a smile, but felt like something else entirely. "You'll just ruin the holiday like always," she said, her voice clear and deliberate, loud enough for everyone at the table to hear. The words hung in the air like smoke, poisoning everything they touched. The carving knife slipped slightly in my grip, and I had to steady myself against the edge of the table. 25 years of Thanksgiving dinners, 25 years of careful preparation and loving service, reduced to this single devastating sentence. I felt something crack inside my chest, not just hurt, but a deeper kind of breaking, the sound of trust shattering into pieces too small to ever put back together. The silence that followed Brittany's words was deafening. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a family enjoying a meal together, but the heavy, suffocating silence that comes when something terrible has been said and no one knows how to respond. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, the sound suddenly loud and intrusive, marking each second that passed while I stood there with the carving knife in my hand, staring at my daughter-in-law's face. My first instinct was to laugh, to brush it off as some kind of misunderstanding or poorly timed joke. Surely she couldn't have meant what she'd just said. Surely this was some kind of miscommunication that could be smoothed over with a smile and a change of subject. But the look in her eyes told me otherwise. There was a coldness there, a deliberate cruelty that made my stomach turn. This wasn't an accident or a slip of the tongue. This was intentional. I felt heat rushing to my cheeks, that burning sensation you get when you've been publicly humiliated. My hands began to shake, not just from shock, but from a kind of rage I'd never allowed myself to feel before. The careful composure I'd maintained for 3 years, the endless patience I'd shown in the face of countless small slights and subtle criticisms, all of it crumbled in that instant. The carving knife felt heavy in my grip, and for one terrifying moment, I understood how people could be driven to actions they never thought themselves capable of. Emma's fork clattered against her plate, the sound sharp and jarring in the terrible quiet. I could see her mouth open slightly, her eyes wide with disbelief. She looked like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Sarah's face had gone pale, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. Even Robert, who prided himself on staying calm in any situation, looked stunned, his usually steady hands clenched into fists on the table. But it was Marcus's face that broke my heart. My son, my gentle, kind-hearted boy, looked like he'd been slapped. The color drained from his cheeks, and I could see him struggling to process what his wife had just said to his mother. He turned to look at Brittany, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, clearly searching for some explanation that would make sense of this moment. The worst part was that Brittany seemed completely unaffected by the devastation she'd just caused. She took a sip of her wine, as casual as if she'd commented on the weather, and reached for the bowl of stuffing with the same serene expression she'd worn when she walked through my front door an hour earlier. The disconnect between her words and her demeanor was so jarring that for a moment I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. But the faces around my table told me I hadn't imagined anything. The carefully constructed perfection of my Thanksgiving dinner lay in ruins, destroyed by 6 words delivered with surgical precision. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand an explanation for this unprovoked attack. Instead, I stood, there like a statue, the carving knife trembling in my grip, feeling smaller and more powerless than I had in decades. The weight of those words settled into my bones like poison. Like always. That phrase echoed in my mind, suggesting a pattern. A failure I'd been blind to, a history of ruined holidays that existed only in Brittany's perception. I thought about every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every Easter I'd hosted over the years. Had I somehow failed in ways I couldn't see? Were my traditions outdated and embarrassing? Was my cooking not up to her standards? The questions swirled in my head, each one more devastating than the last. I realized I was still standing there, frozen in place, while everyone stared at me with expressions ranging from pity to outrage. The turkey sat before me, perfectly cooked and beautifully presented, now seeming like a mockery of my efforts. The dining room that had looked so elegant just moments before felt suffocating, the flickering candles casting shadows that seemed to mock my careful preparations. Setting the carving knife down with deliberate care, I forced myself to take a breath. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. I could feel tears threatening at the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not here, not now, not in front of her. Whatever satisfaction Brittany was seeking from this moment, I wouldn't give her the pleasure of seeing me completely broken. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent the morning worried about every detail being perfect, obsessing over the temperature of the rolls and the consistency of the gravy, when the real threat to my holiday had been sitting right at my table. All those hours of preparation, all that love poured into every dish, rendered meaningless by someone who had never appreciated any of it in the first place. I thought about my mother, who had taught me that hospitality was an act of love, that opening your home and your table to others was one of the most sacred things a woman could do. She'd been gone for 10 years now, but I could still hear her voice telling me that a good hostess never let her guests see her upset, that grace under pressure was the mark of a true lady. But what did grace look like in a moment like this? How was I supposed to respond to such deliberate cruelty with dignity and tact? The problem was that Brittany's words had hit their target with devastating accuracy. Deep down, in the part of myself I tried to keep hidden, I'd been wondering if my efforts were noticed or appreciated. I'd seen the way she looked at my china, like it was some quaint relic from a bygone era. I'd caught her checking her phone during my stories, rolling her eyes when she thought no one was looking. The doubts I'd been suppressing for months suddenly roared to life, fed by 6 words that confirmed my worst fears. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Brittany, what are you talking about?" His confusion was genuine, and I could see him struggling to reconcile the woman he'd married with the person who had just delivered such a calculated blow to his mother. This was probably the first time he'd witnessed her cruelty firsthand. The first time he'd seen the side of her personality she'd been careful to hide from him. She turned to him with that same serene smile, as if his question was perfectly reasonable and her answer would clear everything up. "Oh, come on, Marcus. You know what I mean? The overcomplicated menus, the obsession with doing everything herself, the way she gets so stressed out that everyone has to walk on eggshells. It happens every holiday. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking." The gaslighting was masterful, in its simplicity. She'd taken my dedication and twisted it into neurosis, my love into obsession, my care into a burden everyone else had to bear. And the phrase, "what everyone's thinking," was designed to isolate me further, to make me question whether the people I loved most had been talking about me behind my back, sharing frustrations I'd never known existed. I looked around the table, searching the faces of my family for any sign that Brittany's words held truth. Emma's expression was pure outrage, her protective instincts clearly triggered by the attack on me. Sarah looked like she wanted to reach across the table and throttle. Brittany with her bare hands? Robert's jaw was set in that particular way that meant he was fighting to control his temper, his protective nature warring with his desire to maintain family peace. But it was the devastation in Marcus's eyes that cut me the deepest. I could see him replaying conversations, wondering if he'd missed signs that his wife felt this way, questioning whether there was truth to her accusations. The doubt creeping across his features was almost worse than Brittany's original attack, because it meant her poison was already spreading, infecting the relationships I'd spent a lifetime building. The grandfather clock chimed the half hour, its melodious tones completely at odds with the tension filling the room. Somewhere in the kitchen, I could hear the timer for the rolls going off, the sound somehow absurd in the context of this moment. Life was continuing its normal rhythms while my world fell apart, the mundane details of dinner preparation carrying on regardless of the emotional carnage at my table. I realized that this moment had been building for 3 years. Every subtle criticism, every dismissive comment, every time Brittany had made me feel small and outdated, it had all been leading to this. She'd been testing boundaries, seeing how much she could get away with, how far she could push before someone pushed back. And I'd failed every test, choosing peace over confrontation, family harmony over self-respect. The worst part was recognizing how carefully she'd planned this moment. She'd waited until everyone was present, until we were all seated around the table I'd set with such care, until I was in the most vulnerable position possible. She'd chosen her words for maximum impact, delivered them with perfect timing, and positioned herself as the truth teller in a family of enablers. It was psychological warfare disguised as honesty. Standing there with my hands gripping the edge of the table, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The woman who had spent her entire adult life putting everyone else's comfort before her own, who had swallowed countless small hurts in the name of family peace, was dying a necessary death. In her place, something harder and more self-protective was being born, forged in the fire of public humiliation and private rage. But even as I felt this transformation beginning, I struggled with what to do next. Every instinct I'd developed over 6 decades of life told me to smooth things over, to find a way to move past this moment without causing more damage. I could make excuses for Brittany, blame stress or misunderstanding, turn the other cheek, as I'd been taught to do since childhood. I could salvage the dinner, maintain the facade of family unity, and deal with my hurt in private. The alternative terrified me. Standing up for myself meant risking everything I'd built, potentially fracturing the family I'd devoted my life to protecting. It meant choosing my own dignity over the comfort of others, a choice that went against every lesson I'd learned about being a good wife, mother, and hostess. But as I stood there, feeling the weight of Brittany's contempt and the echo of her cruel words, I began to wonder if the price of peace had become too high to pay. The silence stretched on, growing more uncomfortable with each passing second. I could feel everyone waiting for me to respond, to either defend myself or let the moment pass. The choice felt enormous, like I was standing at a crossroads that would determine the rest of my life. One path led back to the familiar territory of swallowed hurts and buried resentment. The other led into unknown territory where I might finally learn to value my own worth as much as I valued everyone else's. Comfort. Looking at the faces around my table, at the holiday I'd poured my heart into creating, at the woman who had just tried to destroy it all with 6 carefully chosen words, I felt the last of my patience finally, irrevocably, run out. I had spent months telling myself that Brittany's behavior was something I could learn to live with, that her coldness toward me was perhaps just a personality difference or a result of the natural tensions that exist between mothers and daughters-in-law. I'd made excuses for her constant criticism, rationalized her dismissive attitude, and convinced myself that time would heal whatever wounds existed between us. Standing there in the wreckage of my Thanksgiving dinner, I finally understood how naive I'd been. This wasn't about personality differences or natural family tensions. This was about power, about someone who had identified me as a threat to her control over my own son and had decided to eliminate that threat through systematic emotional warfare. Brittany hadn't spoken out of frustration or stress. She'd spoken with the calculated precision of someone who had been planning this moment for months, waiting for the perfect opportunity to deliver maximum damage. The realization was both liberating and devastating. Liberating because it meant I could stop blaming myself for our failed relationship, stop wondering what I'd done wrong or how I could fix things. Devastating because it meant accepting that someone I'd tried so hard to love and welcome into my family had never had any intention of loving me back. I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue when she'd made cutting remarks about my cooking, my decorating, my clothes. All the times I'd smiled and nodded when she'd suggested improvements to traditions that had been meaningful to my family for generations. All the times I'd convinced myself that her cruelty was really just honesty, that her criticism came from a desire to help rather than hurt. The pattern was so clear now that I wondered how I'd missed it for so long. She'd been training me, like a dog, to accept increasingly poor treatment. Each small insult I'd ignored had given her permission to push a little further, to test how much abuse I would tolerate in the name of family harmony. And I'd failed every test, proving again and again that I valued other people's comfort more than my own dignity. But standing there at my own table, surrounded by the family I'd devoted my life to nurturing, something inside me finally said no. No more excuses, no more rationalization, no more sacrificing my self-respect on the altar of keeping everyone else happy. The woman who had walked into my kitchen that morning, worried about the perfect temperature for the rolls, was gone. Beyond her place stood someone I barely recognized, someone harder and angrier and less willing to be anyone's victim. The transformation was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I had options beyond suffering, in silence. I could speak up, fight back, demand the respect I'd been too afraid to ask for. The prospect of conflict still scared me, but not as much as the idea of spending the rest of my life accepting treatment I would never tolerate toward anyone else I loved. I looked at Marcus, my son, the boy I'd raised to be kind and respectful, and wondered how he'd ended up married to someone capable of such casual cruelty. Had I failed him somehow by not teaching him to recognize manipulation? Had I modeled such acceptance of poor treatment that he'd learned to see it as normal? The questions hurt, but they also clarified something important. Whatever I did next would be a lesson for him too, a demonstration of whether love meant accepting abuse or demanding better. Emma was still staring at Brittany with undisguised disgust, her protective instincts clearly triggered by the attack on me. Of all my children, Emma had always been the most direct, the least willing to tolerate nonsense for the sake of politeness. I could see her struggling with the same choice I was facing, weighing the desire to defend me against the fear of causing irreparable family damage. Her support meant everything to me, but I realized this was a battle I needed to fight myself. Sarah caught my eye and gave me the slightest nod, a gesture so small anyone else would have missed it, but which I read perfectly. She was telling me she'd support whatever I decided to do, that she'd stand by me even if it meant choosing sides in a family conflict. Having her in my corner gave me strength I hadn't known I possessed, reminded me that I had allies who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could do for them. Robert was still sitting in stunned silence, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. My husband of 37 years had always been my protector, the person who stood between me and the world's cruelties. But this attack had come from inside our family, from someone we'd welcomed into our home, and I could see him struggling with how to respond. His natural instinct would be to defend me, but doing so meant confronting his daughter-in-law in front of his son, potentially fracturing relationships that had taken years to build. The weight of everyone's expectations pressed down on me like a physical force. I was the matriarch of this family, the keeper of traditions and the maintainer of peace. Everyone was waiting to see how I would handle this crisis, whether I would rise above it with grace or allow it to destroy the harmony I'd worked so hard to create. The responsibility felt crushing, but also clarifying. For once, I had the power to determine the outcome of a situation, rather than simply accepting whatever others chose to dish out. I realized that my response to this moment would define not just this Thanksgiving, but every family gathering that came after. If I let Brittany's words slide, if I pretended they hadn't been said or that they didn't matter, I would be teaching everyone present that I could be treated with disrespect, without consequences. But if I stood up for myself, if I demanded the dignity I deserved, I might save not just my own self-respect, but also prevent Brittany from treating others this way in the future. The turkey sat before me, perfectly carved except for the first slice I'd been in the process of making when Brittany had delivered her blow. It struck me as a metaphor for my life, beautiful on the surface, carefully prepared, but ultimately helpless against the blade. The difference was that I didn't have to be helpless. I could choose to be the one holding the knife rather than the one being carved up. Looking around at my dining room, at the china and silver I'd polished with such care, at the flowers I'd arranged and the candles I'd lit, I felt a surge of righteous anger that surprised me with its intensity. This was my home, my table, my holiday. I had every right to expect basic respect from anyone I welcomed into my space, and I'd been a fool to accept anything less for so long. The clock in the hallway chimed again, marking another quarter hour of my life that I'd never get back. Another moment stolen by someone who had never deserved my kindness in the first place. But it also marked the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another. The woman who had spent 3 years walking on eggshells around Brittany's mood, swings and cruel comments was about to make her final appearance. What came next would be up to the person I was becoming in this crucible of public humiliation and private rage. I straightened my shoulders, smoothed my dress, and prepared to surprise everyone in that room, including myself, with what I was capable of when pushed too far. The scared, accommodating woman they'd all known was about to be replaced by someone who had finally learned the difference between keeping the peace and keeping her dignity. And that difference, I was about to discover, would change everything. The silence in the room had stretched so long it felt like a living thing, pressing against my chest and making it hard to breathe. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could feel the pulse of blood through my veins as my body prepared for fight or flight. But I was done running, done hiding, done making myself smaller to accommodate other people's cruelty. For the first time in 3 years, I was going to take up the space I deserved in my own life, setting down the carving knife with deliberate precision. I looked directly at Brittany, meeting her gaze with a steadiness that surprised me. Her expression remained serene, almost amused, as if she was enjoying the chaos she'd created. That look of satisfaction was the final straw, the last piece of evidence I needed that this had all been calculated and intentional. She wasn't sorry, wasn't embarrassed, wasn't even particularly concerned about the damage she'd done. She was enjoying it. "Excuse me," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. "I need a moment." I walked out of the dining room with as much dignity as I could muster. Through the kitchen where the timer for the rolls was still beeping insistently, through the back door onto the small porch that overlooked my garden. The November air was sharp and clean, a welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere I'd left behind. I leaned against the porch railing, my hands gripping the cold wood, and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. The tears came then, hot and angry and long overdue. They were tears of rage more than sadness, fury at myself for allowing this to happen, at Brittany for her cruelty, at the situation that had forced me to choose between my dignity and my family's peace. I cried for the woman I'd been that morning, full of hope and excitement about bringing everyone together. I cried for the 3 years I'd wasted trying to win the love of someone who had never intended to give it. But even as I cried, I could feel something hardening inside me, crystallizing into a resolve I'd never possessed before. I was done being a victim, done accepting unacceptable behavior because it was easier than fighting. Whatever happened next, however this family crisis played out, I would face it with my spine straight and my head held high. I owed that much to the woman I used to be, and to the woman I was becoming. Through the kitchen window, I could see movement in the dining room. Emma had stood up and was gesturing emphatically, her voice raised though I couldn't make out the words. Sarah was shaking her head, her face flushed with indignation. Robert sat like a statue, his jaw set in that way that meant he was barely containing his temper. And Marcus looked lost, confused, like a child watching his parents fight and not understanding what he'd done wrong. Only Brittany remained calm, still sitting in her chair with that same serene expression, occasionally sipping her wine as if nothing unusual was happening. The sight of her composure while my family fell apart around her was almost more infuriating than her original words had been. She was a bomb that had gone off in the middle of my life, and she was sitting back to admire the damage. I realized that going back in there and pretending nothing had happened wasn't an option anymore. Even if I wanted to swallow my pride and let this slide, Emma and Sarah wouldn't let me. They'd seen the attack for what it was, and they weren't going to pretend otherwise. The choice wasn't between confrontation and peace. It was between honest confrontation and the kind of false peace that enables cruelty to flourish. The back door opened behind me, and I turned to see Robert stepping onto the porch. His face was grim, older looking than it had been an hour ago, and I could see the struggle in his eyes. He'd always hated conflict, had spent our entire marriage trying to keep everyone happy and all relationships smooth. But there was steel in his expression now, a protective anger that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with him all those years ago. "You don't have to go back in there," he said quietly, moving to stand beside me at the railing. "I can handle this." I shook my head, wiping the last of the tears from my cheeks. "No, this is my house, my table, my holiday. I'm not going to be driven out of my own home by someone who has no right to be cruel to me here." He nodded, understanding flooding his features. Robert had always been able to read me better than anyone else, and he could see that something fundamental had shifted in these few minutes alone. The woman who had walked onto this porch was different from the one who was about to walk back into that dining room. "What do you want to do?" he asked, and I heard more than just the immediate question in his voice. He was asking what I wanted to do about Brittany, about the situation with Marcus, about the future of our family dynamics. He was offering to support whatever choice I made, even if it meant difficult conversations and uncomfortable confrontations. I looked back through the kitchen window at the chaos in my dining room, at the beautiful table I'd set with such care now serving as the stage for this ugly drama. I thought about all the holidays that would come after this one, all the family gatherings that could be poisoned by Brittany's presence if I didn't find a way to stop this pattern now. "I want to finish dinner," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "I want to sit at my table, in my home, and enjoy the meal I spent all day preparing. And I want everyone in that room to understand that I will not tolerate being treated with disrespect ever again." Robert smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him since this nightmare began. "There's my Linda," he said, squeezing my hand. "The woman who raised 2 incredible children and kept this family together for 37 years. I was wondering when she was going to show up." His words gave me the final push I needed to walk back into that dining room and reclaim my place at my own table. Whatever happened next, I would face it as myself, not as the diminished version of myself that Brittany had been slowly creating through 3 years of systematic emotional abuse. The scared, accommodating woman was gone. In her place stood someone who had finally learned that demanding respect wasn't selfish. It was necessary. Taking a deep breath of the cold November air, I straightened my shoulders and prepared to return to my family. This Thanksgiving wasn't going to end the way I'd planned, but it was going to end with my dignity intact and my boundaries firmly established. And that, I was beginning to realize, was worth more than any perfectly carved turkey or flawlessly executed dinner could ever be. Walking back into that dining room felt like entering a battlefield where the smoke had just cleared, and everyone was assessing the damage. The conversation stopped abruptly when I appeared in the doorway, all eyes turning to me with expressions ranging from concern to curiosity to barely concealed rage. The beautiful table I'd set with such care now looked like a crime scene, the perfectly arranged place settings disrupted by abandoned plates and overturned napkins, wine glasses sitting at odd angles where people had pushed back from the table in shock. Emma was standing behind her chair, her hands gripping the back of it so tightly her knuckles were white. My daughter's face was flushed with anger, and I could see she'd been in the middle of saying something when I walked in. Sarah was leaning forward in her seat, her eyes blazing with protective fury, looking every bit like the fierce friend who had stood by me through every crisis of the past 20 years. Marcus sat slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, looking like he'd aged a decade in the few minutes I'd been gone. And Brittany sat exactly as I'd left her, serene and untouchable, twirling her wine glass between her fingers with the casual air of someone who had just commented on the weather rather than delivered a devastating blow to her hostess. The contrast between her composure and everyone else's distress was so stark it took my breath away. She looked up at me as I entered, that same cold smile playing at the corners of her mouth, and I realized she was waiting to see if I would slink back to my place defeated or if I would dare to challenge her. The moment stretched between us like a taut wire, charged with 3 years of accumulated tension and unspoken resentments. Everyone else in the room seemed to fade into the background as Brittany and I engaged in a silent battle of wills, each of us measuring the other's resolve. She'd thrown down the gauntlet with her cruel words, but now it was my turn to respond, and I could see in her eyes that she wasn't entirely certain what I was capable of. I walked to my place at the head of the table with deliberate calm, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the heavy silence, each step a declaration that I was reclaiming my space, my authority, my right to be treated with basic human decency in my own home. I didn't sit down immediately. Instead, I stood behind my chair, looking at each person around the table, taking in their faces, their postures, their reactions to this moment that would define the future of our family dynamics. "I've been thinking," I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying easily across the room, "about what was just said at my table, in my home, during the holiday I spent days preparing." I paused, letting the weight of those words settle over everyone present. "And I've realized something important." Brittany's smile faltered slightly, perhaps sensing that my response wasn't going to be the tearful retreat she'd been expecting. Marcus looked up from his hands, his eyes red-rimmed and confused, clearly hoping I was about to smooth things over and restore the peace he so desperately wanted. Emma and Sarah leaned forward slightly, their expressions suggesting they knew something significant was about to happen. "I've realized that I've been enabling behavior that I would never accept from anyone else in my life," I continued, my gaze moving deliberately around the table before settling on Brittany. "I've been so concerned with keeping everyone comfortable that I've forgotten to insist on basic respect for myself." The words felt strange in my mouth, foreign and powerful. I'd never spoken this way before, never claimed space for my own feelings and needs with such directness. The woman who had walked out of this room 10 minutes ago would have found a way to apologize, to take responsibility for everyone else's discomfort, to smooth over the conflict at the expense of her own dignity. But that woman was gone, and in her place stood someone who had finally learned the difference between keeping the peace and keeping herself whole. Brittany's composure was beginning to crack slightly around the edges. She set down her wine glass with more force than necessary, the sound sharp against the table, "Linda, I think you're overreacting," she said, her voice carrying that patronizing tone I'd learned to dread. "I was just making an observation. You do tend to get a bit overwhelmed during holidays, and it affects everyone." The gaslighting was so blatant, so perfectly executed, that for a moment, I almost fell back into the old pattern of self-doubt. Almost. But something had fundamentally shifted in me during those minutes on the porch. Something that couldn't be undone by her attempts to rewrite reality. I'd seen the cruelty in her eyes when she'd delivered that blow, had witnessed the satisfaction she'd taken in my pain. There was no innocent explanation for what she'd done, no way to spin her words into anything other than a deliberate attack. "No," I said simply, the word carrying more power than I'd known I possessed. "That's not what happened here, and we both know it." The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet after her original attack. This was the silence of a line being drawn, of boundaries being established, of someone finally saying enough. I could feel the energy in the room shifting, the dynamic that had held our family in its grip for 3 years beginning to crack and reshape itself around this new reality. Emma stood up straighter, and I could see pride mixing with the anger in her expression. She'd been watching me accept poor treatment for years, probably wondering when I would finally stand up for myself. Sarah nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture of approval and support that gave me strength. Even Robert, standing in the doorway behind me, seemed to exhale in relief, as if he'd been holding his breath for 3 years waiting for this moment. But it was Marcus's face that held my attention. My son looked confused and hurt, caught between loyalty to his wife and love for his mother, probably realizing for the first time that there had been an ongoing conflict he'd been blind to. The pain in his eyes nearly broke my resolve, nearly sent me back into the old pattern of protecting everyone else's feelings at the expense of my own. But I forced myself to remember that allowing this behavior to continue wouldn't protect him. It would only teach him that love meant accepting abuse. "Marcus," I said gently, turning to face my son directly, "I love you more than life itself. You know that, but I need you to understand something important." I paused, choosing my words carefully, knowing that what I said next would affect our relationship forever. What just happened wasn't about holiday stress or different personality styles. It was about someone deliberately trying to hurt me and succeeding. He opened his mouth to protest, to offer some explanation that would make sense of his wife's behavior, but I held up my hand to stop him. "I'm not asking you to choose sides," I continued. "I'm simply telling you that I will not accept being treated with cruelty and disrespect in my own home, by anyone, for any reason." The words hung in the air like a challenge, not just to Brittany, but to everyone present. I was establishing new rules for how I expected to be treated, drawing lines that hadn't existed before, claiming space for my own dignity that I'd never insisted on. It was terrifying and exhilarating and absolutely necessary. Brittany's mask was slipping now, the serene facade giving way to something harder and more calculating. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice rising slightly. "You're turning a simple comment into some kind of dramatic production. This is exactly what I was talking about. You always have to be the center of attention, always have to make everything about your feelings." The projection was breathtaking in its audacity. She was taking the very behavior she'd just exhibited, making herself the center of attention by destroying a family gathering, and attributing it to me. It was a masterclass in manipulation, the kind of emotional sleight of hand that had kept me confused and self-doubting for years. But this time, I saw it for what it was. "You're right about one thing," I said, my voice growing stronger. "This is about my feelings. It's about my right to feel safe and respected in my own home. It's about my right to expect basic kindness from people I welcome at my table." I could see Emma nodding vigorously in my peripheral vision, and Sarah made a small sound of approval. Even Marcus seemed to be processing my words, his confusion giving way to something that might have been understanding. The tide was turning. The balance of power in the room shifting away from Brittany's ability to control the narrative through manipulation and gaslighting. Furthermore, I continued, feeling momentum building, this isn't the first time something like this has happened. It's just the first time I've had the courage to call it what it is. I looked directly at Brittany, meeting her gaze without flinching. For 3 years, I've made excuses for your behavior, convinced myself that your criticism was constructive, that your coldness was just your personality. But what happened here today made me realize that I've been lying to myself. The truth was pouring out of me now. 3 years of suppressed observations and buried hurts finally seeing daylight. I thought about all the small moments of cruelty I'd rationalized away, all the times I'd blamed myself for not being good enough, rather, than recognizing that I was being systematically torn down by someone who saw my kindness as weakness. I've been allowing you to train me to accept unacceptable treatment, I said, the words coming faster now as the full scope of the dynamic became clear to me. Every time I ignored a cutting remark, every time I pretended your criticism was helpful, every time I swallowed my hurt to keep the peace, I was teaching you that you could treat me poorly without consequences. Brittany's face was flushed now, her composure completely shattered. You're being completely unreasonable, she snapped. I was trying to help you see that you stress yourself out unnecessarily. If you can't handle honest feedback, that's your problem, not mine. The word honest was like a match thrown on gasoline. Honest? I repeated, my voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. There was nothing honest about what you said. It was cruel, it was calculated, and it was designed to hurt me in front of my family. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. I could feel everyone in the room holding their breath, witnessing a confrontation that had been building for years finally coming to a head. This wasn't just about one cruel comment anymore. It was about patterns of behavior, about power dynamics, about the choice between enabling cruelty and demanding better. And the most telling thing, I continued, my voice gaining strength with each word, is that you're not sorry. You're not embarrassed or ashamed of what you said. You're angry that I'm calling you out on it. That tells me everything I need to know about your intentions. The accusation hit its mark. Brittany's face went pale, then flushed again, and I could see her struggling to find a response that would regain control of the situation. She looked around the table, perhaps hoping to find an ally, someone who would step in to defend her or minimize what she'd done. But Emma's expression was thunderous. Sarah was shaking her head in disgust, and even Marcus was looking at his wife with something that might have been disappointment. I think you should leave, I said quietly, the words coming from a place of such certainty that they surprised even me. This is my home, my table, my holiday, and I'm not going to allow you to poison it any further. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke, no one seemed to breathe. The request hung in the air like a sword, cutting through 3 years of accumulated resentment and false politeness to the heart of the matter. I was drawing the ultimate boundary, exercising my right to remove someone from my space who had proven themselves incapable of treating me with basic respect. Brittany's mouth opened and closed several times, clearly struggling to process what had just happened. She'd come to my table expecting to deliver another blow to my self-esteem, and instead found herself being asked to leave. The power dynamic she'd worked so hard to establish was crumbling around her, and she could see it in the faces of everyone present. You can't be serious, she finally managed, her voice shaky for the first time since I'd known her. Marcus, are you going to let her talk to me this way? All eyes turned to my son, who sat frozen in his chair, caught between the woman who had given him life and the woman he'd chosen to share his life with. The position was impossible, and I felt a moment of sympathy for him even in the midst of my own pain. But I also knew that this was a moment that would define not just our relationship, but his understanding of what love should look like. Marcus looked back and forth between his wife and his mother, his face a picture of anguish. "Brittany," he said slowly, his voice heavy with emotion. "What you said was really hurtful. I don't understand why you would say something like that to my mom." It wasn't a full condemnation, but it was acknowledgement. And I could see from Brittany's expression that even this mild pushback was more than she'd expected. She'd counted on his automatic support, his reflex to protect her even when she was in the wrong. The fact that he was questioning her behavior at all represented a crack in the foundation of control she'd built their relationship on. "I was just being honest," she repeated, but the words sounded hollow now, desperate. Someone needs to tell her the truth about how her behavior affects people. "No," Emma said, speaking for the first time since I'd returned to the room. Her voice was quiet but filled with steel. "That's not what happened here, and you know it. You deliberately said something cruel to hurt my mother, and now you're trying to gaslight all of us into believing it was some kind of favor." My daughter's support meant everything to me in that moment. Emma had always been protective, but she'd also been careful not to interfere in family dynamics that didn't directly involve her. The fact that she was speaking up now, taking a clear stand, showed me that what I was doing was right and necessary. Sarah nodded emphatically. "I've been watching this pattern for 3 years," she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had no family loyalties to protect. "Linda has bent over backwards to welcome you into this family, and you've done nothing but find fault with everything she does. What you said today was unforgivable." The support from the two women who knew me best was like armor, protecting me from any doubt about whether I was overreacting or being unfair. They'd witnessed the slow erosion of my confidence, the gradual dimming of my spirit under the constant criticism, and they were standing with me as I finally said enough. Brittany looked around the table one more time, perhaps hoping to find some crack in the united front that was forming against her behavior. But there was none. Even Marcus, though clearly conflicted, wasn't rushing to her defense. The spell she'd cast over our family dynamics was finally broken, and everyone could see the situation for what it really was. "Fine," she said, standing abruptly and throwing her napkin down on the table. "If this is how you want to play it, Linda, then we're done here. But don't expect us to come crawling back when you realize how wrong you are." The threat was her final attempt to regain control, to make me believe that standing up for myself would cost me my relationship with my son. It was emotional blackmail of the most basic kind, designed to send me scurrying back to the familiar territory of self-doubt and accommodation. But I'd traveled too far from that place to return now. "I'll have to live with that," I said simply, and meant it. The finality in my voice seemed to shock her more than anything else I'd said. She'd expected tears, apologies, desperate attempts to salvage the relationship. Instead, she found someone who had finally learned that some prices were too high to pay, even for family peace. Brittany grabbed her purse from the counter where she'd left it and stormed toward the front door, her heels clicking angrily on the hardwood floor. Marcus sat for a moment, clearly torn, before slowly standing to follow her. The sight of my son leaving broke my heart, but I knew that this moment was necessary, that enabling her behavior any longer would only make things worse for everyone involved. "Marcus," I called after him, and he stopped in the doorway. "I love you. That will never change. But I won't apologize for demanding to be treated with respect." He nodded, tears in his eyes, and I could see him struggling with emotions, too complex for words. "I know, Mom," he said quietly. I need some time to think about all this." And then they were gone, the front door closing behind them with a finality that echoed through the house. The dining room fell silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. I stood there for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened, the bridge I'd just burned, the stand I'd just taken. When I finally looked around the table, I saw 3 faces looking back at me with expressions of pride, support, and understanding. Emma, Sarah, and Robert. The people who truly knew me and loved me for who I was rather than what I could do for them. The family that was left was smaller than it had been an hour ago, but it was also more authentic, more honest, more loving. "Well," Sarah said, breaking the silence with her trademark dry humor. That was dramatic, but absolutely necessary. Emma came around the table and wrapped me in a hug that threatened to break down the composure I'd fought so hard to maintain. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," she whispered in my ear. "I've been waiting 3 years for you to do that." Robert appeared at my other side, his arms encircling both his wife and daughter in an embrace that felt like coming home. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. It was hard, but it was right. Standing there in the ruins of my carefully planned Thanksgiving dinner, surrounded by the people who truly loved me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the false peace that comes from avoiding conflict at any cost, but the deep, abiding peace that comes from finally standing up for yourself and discovering that the sky doesn't fall when you do. The turkey was cold now, the side dishes congealing. On their serving platters, the candles burned down to stubs. The perfect holiday I'd envisioned was destroyed, but in its place was something more valuable. My self-respect, my boundaries, my refusal to accept unacceptable treatment. I'd chosen myself over the false harmony that had been slowly killing my spirit, and though the choice had been painful, I knew it was the beginning of something better. Looking at the faces of the people who remained at my table, I realized that this might not be the Thanksgiving I'd planned, but it was exactly the Thanksgiving I'd needed. It was the day I'd finally learned that loving someone doesn't mean accepting their cruelty, that family doesn't give anyone the right to treat you poorly, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior. The woman who had woken up that morning worried about the perfect temperature for the rolls was gone forever. In her place stood someone stronger, clearer, more authentic. Someone who had learned that respect isn't something you earn by being perfect. It's something you demand by knowing your own worth. And for the first time in 3 years, I felt worthy of the love that surrounded me, worthy of the life I was, finally brave enough to claim as my own. The weeks that followed that Thanksgiving were unlike anything I'd experienced in my adult life. For the first time in 3 years, I woke up each morning without the underlying dread that had become my constant companion, that nagging anxiety about what Brittany might say or do next to make me feel small and inadequate. The absence of that weight was startling, like taking off a heavy coat I hadn't realized I'd been wearing. My house felt different too, lighter somehow, as if the very walls had been holding their breath and could finally exhale. The silence from Marcus was deafening, but not unexpected. I'd known when I made my stand that there would be consequences, that forcing him to confront his wife's behavior might cost me my relationship with my son, at least temporarily. Still, the reality of it was harder than I'd anticipated. For 31 years, Marcus had been a constant presence in my life, calling twice a week, stopping by on weekends, sharing the small details of his daily existence that make up the fabric of family life. His absence left a hole that seemed to echo through every room of my house. Emma had extended her stay through the weekend, ostensibly to help with leftovers, but really to make sure I was holding up under the emotional strain of what had happened. My daughter moved through the house like a protective shield, fielding phone calls from well-meaning relatives who'd heard fragments of the story and wanted to offer advice or express opinions. She screened visitors, monitored my mood, and generally appointed herself my guardian angel during those fragile first days after the confrontation. "You know what surprised me most?" she said one evening as we sat in the living room, sharing a bottle of wine while Robert worked on his latest woodworking project in the garage. "How relieved I felt when you finally stood up to her. I didn't realize how much her behavior was affecting all of us, not just you." Her words opened a door to conversations we'd never had before, honest discussions about the dynamics that had shaped our family gatherings for the past 3 years. Emma told me about dreading holidays because of the tension Brittany created, about watching me shrink a little more each time we were all together, about wanting to say something but not knowing how without creating an even bigger rift. I kept thinking it would get better, she admitted, curling up in the corner of the couch with her legs tucked under her. That maybe once she felt more secure in the family, she'd stop being so cold. But it just kept getting worse, and you kept making excuses for her. The truth in her words stung, but it was a clean hurt, the kind that comes from facing reality rather than living in denial. I had made excuses, had convinced myself that Brittany's behavior would improve if I just tried harder, loved more, accepted more. The pattern was so clear now that I wondered how I'd been blind to it for so long. Sarah became my lifeline during those difficult weeks, stopping by daily with coffee and conversation. Her presence a reminder that some relationships are built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and endurance. She'd never liked Brittany, had made that clear from the beginning, but she'd respected my need to try to make the relationship work. Now she felt free to speak honestly about what she'd observed over the past 3 years. "That girl was never going to accept you," she said bluntly one afternoon as we sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd spent countless hours worrying about what I could do differently to win Brittany's approval. "Some people are just threatened by kindness, especially the genuine kind. It makes them feel small, so they try to make everyone else smaller to even things out." Her insight helped me understand something I'd been struggling with: why my attempts to be welcoming and loving had seemed to make things worse rather than better. Brittany hadn't seen my kindness as a gift to be appreciated. She'd seen it as a challenge to be defeated, a reminder of everything she wasn't. My very existence as a loving mother-in-law had been a threat to the narrative she'd constructed about herself and her relationships. The isolation from Marcus was the hardest part. I found myself picking up the phone to call him dozens of times, my finger hovering over his number before I forced myself to put the phone down. I wanted to apologize, to smooth things over, to return to the familiar pattern of putting everyone else's comfort before my own dignity. The urge was so strong it was almost physical, like an addiction I was trying to break. But each time I came close to caving, I remembered Brittany's face at that dinner table, the satisfaction in her eyes when she'd delivered that cruel blow, the complete absence of remorse or shame. I remembered the 3 years of small cruelties, the gradual erosion of my confidence, the way I'd started to see myself through her critical eyes. Going back to that would mean teaching everyone in my family that boundaries were negotiable, that love meant accepting abuse, that keeping the peace was more important than keeping my soul intact. 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, Emma had to return to her job in Columbus, and I faced the prospect of being truly alone with my decision for the first time. The house felt enormous and quiet, every sound amplified in the absence of the family, chaos I'd grown accustomed to. I wandered through rooms that had been filled with laughter and conversation just days before, touching surfaces I'd polished with such care, straightening photographs that captured happier times when our family felt whole and uncomplicated. It was during one of these lonely afternoons that I decided to start cleaning out closets, a task I'd been putting off for months. Physical activity had always been my way of processing emotional turmoil, and there was something therapeutic about sorting through accumulated possessions, deciding what to keep and what to let go. In the back of the hall closet, I found a box of Marcus's childhood mementos that I'd saved for decades, planning to give them to him someday when he had children of his own. Looking through those treasures, I was transported back to the boy. He'd been curious, tender-hearted, quick to defend anyone he perceived as being treated unfairly. Report cards full of teacher comments about his kindness to classmates, artwork he'd made me for Mother's Day, photographs of birthday parties and family vacations when life was simpler, and our love for each other was uncomplicated by the politics of adult relationships. That boy would have been horrified by what had happened at my dinner table. He would have stood up for me without hesitation, would have seen Brittany's cruelty for what it was immediately. Somewhere along the way, that instinct had been worn down or overridden, replaced by the desire to keep his wife happy even at the cost of his mother's dignity. The realization broke my heart, but it also strengthened my resolve. By standing up for myself, I'd given him the opportunity to remember who he really was beneath the layers of compromise and accommodation that marriage sometimes requires. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, just as I was beginning to accept that this estrangement might be permanent, Marcus showed up at my door. I was in the kitchen making soup when I heard his key in the front door, the same key he'd had since high school, and my heart practically leaped out of my chest. For a moment, I considered hiding, pretending I wasn't home, avoiding the conversation I'd been both dreading and longing for since that terrible dinner. But that would have been the old Linda, the one who avoided conflict at all costs. The new version of myself smoothed her apron, turned down the heat under the soup pot, and walked to the front door to face whatever my son had come to say. He looked terrible. Thinner than he'd been just weeks before, with dark circles under his eyes and the haggard expression of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. His usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by uncertainty and what looked like genuine anguish. When our eyes met, I saw the little boy who used to run to me for comfort when the world felt too big and complicated, and it took every ounce of willpower I possessed not to immediately fold him into my arms and promise that everything would be okay. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly, his voice rusty from disuse. "Can we talk?" I nodded and led him to the living room, the same room where we'd shared so many conversations over the years, where I'd listened to his dreams and fears and offered whatever wisdom I could. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the physical distance between us reflecting the emotional chasm that had opened up since Thanksgiving. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Marcus stared at his hands, clearly struggling with how to begin, while I waited with the patience I'd learned from 31 years of motherhood. Finally, he looked up, and I could see tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "I've been thinking about what happened," he said slowly, each word carefully chosen. "About what Brittany said, about how you responded, about everything that led up to that moment. And I need you to know that I'm sorry." The apology hung between us like a bridge, tentative but real. I wanted to rush across it, to accept his words and move on as if nothing had changed. But I'd learned too much about myself in the past few weeks to settle for a surface reconciliation. "What exactly are you sorry for?" I asked gently, needing to understand whether he truly grasped what had happened or was simply trying to restore family harmony without addressing the underlying issues. He was quiet for another long moment, and I could see him wrestling with the answer. "I'm sorry that I didn't see what was happening," he said finally. "I'm sorry that I let her treat you the way she did for so long. I'm sorry that I made excuses for behavior that was inexcusable. And I'm sorry that it took something so horrible for me to finally open my eyes." The words were everything I'd hoped to hear and more. They meant that Marcus had done the hard work of examining his own role in the situation, of looking honestly at patterns he'd preferred to ignore. They meant that my son was still the man I'd raised him to be, underneath all the compromises and accommodations. "She told me you were overreacting," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "That you were being dramatic and vindictive, that you'd always resented her and were looking for an excuse to cause problems. And for a few days, I wanted to believe that, because it would have been easier than admitting that I'd married someone capable of such deliberate cruelty." The honesty in his admission took my breath away. I could see how much it had cost him to come to these realizations, to acknowledge that the woman he'd chosen to spend his life with had a capacity for meanness that he'd either missed or chosen to overlook. "But then I started really thinking about it," he said, leaning forward slightly. "About all the little moments over the past 3 years, All the times I'd felt uncomfortable about something she'd said or done but talked myself out of addressing it. All the times I'd seen you look hurt or confused and convinced myself I was imagining things. The pattern was there, Mom. I just didn't want to see it. Hearing him acknowledge what I'd experienced for so long was like having a weight lifted from my chest. For 3 years, I'd questioned my own perceptions, wondered if I was being too sensitive or reading malice into innocent comments. Having Marcus validate my experience, admit that the pattern had been real and observable, gave me a sense of vindication I hadn't known I needed. I kept telling myself that she was just adjusting to being part of the family, he continued. That she was insecure or overwhelmed, that she'd warm up eventually. But what she said at Thanksgiving wasn't about adjustment or insecurity. It was calculated and cruel, designed to hurt you in the most painful way possible. The fact that he could see Brittany's behavior clearly now gave me hope, but it also made me deeply sad for what he was going through. Recognizing that someone you love is capable of deliberate cruelty is one of the most painful realizations a person can have. I could see the grief in his eyes, the mourning for the relationship he'd thought he had, the woman he'd believed his wife to be. What happens now? I asked, because I needed to understand where this left us, where it left his marriage, where it left our family. Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the garden I'd been neglecting since Thanksgiving. I don't know, he said finally. We've been in counseling since the week after Thanksgiving. Brittany thinks the therapist is taking my side, that I'm ganging up on her with you. She can't seem to understand that what she did was wrong, or if she does understand it, she can't admit it. The information didn't surprise me, but it saddened me nonetheless. People capable of the kind of calculated cruelty Brittany had displayed rarely had the self-awareness necessary for genuine change. They were more likely to double down, to play the victim, to find ways to blame everyone else for the consequences of their own behavior. I'm not asking you to choose between us, I said carefully, though we both knew that in many ways he already had simply by coming here. I just need you to understand that I won't accept being treated that way anymore, by anyone, for any reason. He nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I know, and you shouldn't have to. I should have protected you from that, should have seen it sooner, should have said something long before it got to that point. The regret in his voice was genuine, and I could see that he truly understood the scope of what had happened. The ways he'd failed not just me, but himself, by allowing the situation to continue unchecked. That understanding was the foundation for whatever relationship we would build going forward. You're here now, I said simply. That's what matters. We talked for another hour, filling in the gaps of the past 3 weeks, sharing feelings and observations that had been building for years. Marcus told me about conversations with Brittany that had left him feeling confused and manipulated, about her ability to twist situations until he questioned his own perceptions. I told him about the gradual erosion of my confidence, the way I'd started to see myself through her critical eyes, the relief I'd felt when I finally said enough. By the time he left, something fundamental had shifted between us. We were no longer walking on eggshells around the topic of Brittany, no longer pretending that family harmony was more important than honesty. We'd acknowledged a painful truth and survived it, had chosen each other despite the complications that choice created. The following months brought their own challenges. Marcus and Brittany's marriage became increasingly strained as counseling forced them to confront issues they'd both been avoiding. She resented his newfound willingness to set boundaries, to call out behavior that made him uncomfortable. He struggled with recognizing how much of their relationship had been built on his acceptance of treatment he would never tolerate from anyone else. I stayed out of it as much as possible, offering support when Marcus asked for it, but refusing to be drawn into the drama of their disintegrating marriage. I'd learned the hard way that you can't force people to treat you well, can't love someone into being kind, can't sacrifice enough of yourself to transform someone else's character. All you can do is decide what you will and won't accept. Then, live according to those standards regardless of the consequences. 6 months after that Thanksgiving dinner, Marcus filed for divorce. The decision was agonizing for him, but ultimately necessary. He'd finally understood that marriage should enhance your life rather than diminish it, that love should feel safe rather than dangerous, that respect isn't something you negotiate but something you require. The divorce was messy and painful, as divorces often are. Brittany fought for everything she could get, including trying to turn Marcus's family against him by spreading her version of events far and wide. But the people who truly knew us, who had witnessed years of family dynamics, weren't fooled by her attempts to rewrite history. They remembered the woman who had been welcomed with open arms and had responded with criticism and contempt. A year after that terrible Thanksgiving, we gathered again around my dining table. This time, it was just the 4 of us: Robert, Emma, Marcus, and me. The conversation flowed freely, punctuated by laughter and the kind of easy affection that had always characterized our family before Brittany's arrival. There were no walking on eggshells, no careful avoidance of sensitive topics, no underlying tension waiting to explode. Marcus seemed lighter, younger, more like the man he'd been before his marriage had begun slowly crushing his spirit. He was dating someone new, a woman named Jennifer who worked as a teacher and possessed the kind of quiet kindness that complemented rather than competed with our family dynamics. She'd joined us for coffee earlier that week, and I'd been struck by how naturally she fit into our conversation, how she listened with genuine interest rather than looking for ammunition for future attacks. "I've been thinking about something," Marcus said as we lingered over dessert, the dishes forgotten in favor of the kind of meandering conversation that makes holidays memorable. "About the difference between keeping the peace and enabling destructive behavior. I spent so many years thinking that love meant avoiding conflict at all costs, that being supportive meant accepting whatever someone dished out." His words revealed a depth of understanding that had been hard-won through pain and loss. He'd learned what I'd learned that terrible Thanksgiving day. That real love sometimes looks like saying no. That healthy relationships require boundaries. That respect isn't negotiable. "You taught me something important that day, Mom," he continued, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "You taught me that standing up for yourself isn't selfish or vindictive. It's necessary. And you taught me what dignity looks like in action." The praise meant more to me than any compliment I'd ever received, because it came from someone who had witnessed my transformation from victim to survivor, from people-pleaser to woman with boundaries. It meant that the painful choice I'd made that Thanksgiving had ripple effects beyond my own life, had taught lessons that would shape how Marcus approached relationships for the rest of his life. Looking around that table at the faces of the people who truly loved me, I felt a contentment I hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the false peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the deep satisfaction that comes from living authentically, from demanding the respect you deserve, from choosing relationships that enhance rather than diminish your life. The woman who had woken up that Thanksgiving morning 3 years ago, worried about perfect temperatures and flawless execution, was gone forever. In her place sat someone who had learned that the most important ingredient in any gathering wasn't the food or the decorations or the carefully coordinated details. It was the love and respect shared by the people around the table, the safety to be yourself without fear of attack, the knowledge that you are valued for who you are rather than what you can provide. That terrible Thanksgiving had cost me plenty. It had cost me my relationship with Brittany, the illusion of family harmony, the comfortable fiction that love conquered all. But it had given me something far more valuable: my self-respect, my boundaries, and the understanding that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior. As we cleared the table that night, I caught my reflection in the dining room mirror and was surprised by what I saw. The woman looking back at me had clear eyes and straight shoulders, the bearing of someone who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to insist that others recognize it too. She looked strong, confident, unafraid. She looked like someone I'd always wanted to be but had never had the courage to become. The journey from that first terrible Thanksgiving to this peaceful one hadn't been easy. There had been lonely nights and difficult conversations, moments of doubt and regret, fears that I'd chosen my pride over my family. But standing in my dining room surrounded by people who loved and respected me, I knew I'd made the right choice. I'd chosen myself, and in doing so, I'd created space for authentic relationships built on mutual respect rather than one-sided accommodation. Some battles are worth fighting, even when the cost is high. Some bridges are worth burning when they lead to places that diminish your soul. Some relationships are worth losing when keeping them requires you to lose yourself. That Thanksgiving dinner taught me that my dignity wasn't negotiable, my peace wasn't for sale, and my worth wasn't dependent on other people's approval. The woman who had trembled with that carving knife in her hand, who had absorbed blow after blow in the name of family harmony, had found her voice and learned to use it. She had discovered that standing up for yourself doesn't make you selfish, it makes you strong. She had learned that love without respect is just another form of abuse, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act a woman can perform is simply refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. That knowledge had transformed not just my relationship with Brittany, but my relationship with myself. I would never again be the woman who apologized for other people's cruelty, who made excuses for inexcusable behavior, who sacrificed her own dignity on the altar of keeping everyone else comfortable. I had learned to love myself enough to demand better, and that lesson had changed everything. 2 years had passed since that life-changing Thanksgiving, and I barely recognized the woman I'd become. Standing in my kitchen on a crisp October morning, preparing for another family gathering, I marveled at how different everything felt. The anxiety that used to consume me for weeks before hosting had been replaced by genuine excitement. The careful choreography of trying to please everyone had given way to the simple joy of bringing together people who genuinely cared about each other. This time, we were celebrating Emma's engagement to David, a fellow nurse she'd met at the hospital. He was everything Brittany had never been: kind, respectful, genuinely interested in our family's stories and traditions. When Emma had brought him home for the first time 6 months ago, I'd held my breath, waiting for some sign of judgment or criticism. Instead, he'd complimented the house, asked about the family photos lining the hallway, and spent an hour listening to Robert tell stories about his woodworking projects. The contrast was so stark, it was almost comical. Where Brittany had found fault with everything from my cooking to my decorating choices, David seemed to appreciate the warmth and history embedded in our home. Where she had made cutting remarks disguised as helpful suggestions, he offered genuine compliments and asked thoughtful questions. Most importantly, where she had diminished Emma's connection to her family, David celebrated it, understanding that loving my daughter meant embracing the people who had shaped her. Marcus would be bringing Jennifer, the teacher he'd been dating for over a year now. Their relationship had developed slowly, carefully, both of them still healing from the wreckage of his marriage to Brittany. Jennifer possessed a quiet strength that reminded me of myself before I'd learned to doubt my own worth. She treated Marcus with the kind of respect and affection that made him bloom, returning him to the confident, happy man I remembered from before his first marriage had begun, eroding his spirit. What struck me most about Jennifer was her complete lack of competitiveness with our family relationships. She didn't see Marcus's love for his mother as a threat to be neutralized, but as evidence of his capacity for loyalty and devotion. She appreciated the traditions we'd built over decades rather than dismissing them as outdated obstacles to her own vision of how things should be. Most remarkably, she seemed to understand that joining a family meant adding to its richness rather than trying to reshape it in your own image. The guest list for today's celebration was deliberately small, limited to people who had proven themselves capable of treating each other with basic kindness and respect. Sarah would be there, of course, bringing her signature blend of wisdom and humor. My sister Margaret was driving up from Cincinnati with her husband Tom, both of them steady, reliable presences who had supported me through the difficult years of learning to set boundaries. Emma's college roommate Katie, who had become like a second daughter to me, would round out the group. As I moved through the familiar rhythms of preparation, I thought about how different this felt from those anxiety-ridden mornings when Brittany's presence had cast a shadow over every gathering. There was no walking on eggshells, no careful consideration of how every word might be twisted into ammunition for future attacks. I could focus on what hosting had always been meant to be, an expression of love and hospitality, a way of creating joy for people who mattered to me. The dining room looked beautiful in the afternoon light, but the beauty came from genuine warmth rather than desperate perfection. I'd learned to distinguish between the pleasure of creating something lovely and the exhausting pressure of trying to meet impossible standards. The flowers on the table were from my own garden, arranged with care but not obsessed over. The menu featured dishes I actually enjoyed making rather than complicated showpieces designed to impress. Everything felt authentic, sustainable, joyful. Emma arrived first, practically glowing with happiness as she showed off her engagement ring for the 100th time. David followed close behind, carrying a bottle of wine and wearing the slightly nervous expression of someone who still couldn't quite believe his good fortune in finding my daughter. Watching them together filled me with a contentment I'd never experienced during Marcus's first engagement. This relationship felt solid, built on mutual respect and genuine compatibility rather than physical attraction and wishful thinking. "Mom, the table looks gorgeous," Emma said, wrapping me in one of her enthusiastic hugs. "But more importantly, you look gorgeous, happy, relaxed." Her observation made me smile, because I could feel the truth of it in my bones. The constant tension I'd carried for years had finally left my body, replaced by the deep peace that comes from living authentically. I no longer exhausted myself trying to anticipate and prevent other people's negative reactions. I no longer twisted myself into pretzels attempting to manage everyone else's emotions. I simply showed up as myself and trusted that the people who truly belonged in my life would appreciate what I had to offer. Marcus and Jennifer arrived as I was putting the finishing touches on dinner, and I felt that familiar surge of maternal pride as I watched my son help his girlfriend out of their car. He looked healthy and content, his face free of the stress, lines that had appeared during his marriage to Brittany. Jennifer moved with quiet confidence, carrying herself like someone who felt secure in her relationships and comfortable in her own skin. "Something smells incredible," Jennifer said as they came through the front door, and I could tell she meant it. There was no backhanded compliment hidden beneath her words, no subtle suggestion that things could be improved. She was simply expressing genuine appreciation, the kind of straightforward interaction I'd almost forgotten was possible. The evening unfolded with the easy rhythm of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. Conversation flowed naturally from topic to topic, without anyone needing to monitor their words for potential landmines. Laughter came frequently and felt effortless. Even the inevitable small disagreements about politics or current events remained respectful, characterized by curiosity rather than the need to prove superiority. As we lingered over dessert, I found myself thinking about all the family gatherings that had come before this one. The years of carefully managed interactions, of smoothing over conflicts that should never have been tolerated, of accepting treatment that gradually eroded my sense of self-worth. Those experiences felt like they had happened to someone else, a previous version of myself who hadn't yet learned that love should feel safe rather than dangerous. "I want to propose a toast," David said, raising his wine glass as the conversation naturally paused. "To Linda, for creating such a welcoming home and raising such an incredible daughter. And to all of you, for making me feel like part of the family from day one." The toast was simple and heartfelt, exactly the kind of moment that made hosting worthwhile. As we clinked glasses, I caught Marcus's eye across the table and saw him nod slightly. A gesture of acknowledgement and approval that meant more to me than any elaborate speech could have. He understood what this evening represented, the kind of authentic family connection we'd both fought so hard to preserve and protect. Later, as we were clearing the table, Jennifer approached me in the kitchen. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had something important to say, but wasn't quite sure how to begin. I continued loading the dishwasher, giving her time to find her words while making it clear I was available to listen. "Linda," she said finally, "I hope this isn't overstepping, but I wanted you to know how much I admire what you did. Marcus told me about what happened with Brittany, about how you finally stood up for yourself. I know it couldn't have been easy." Her words took me by surprise, not because they were inappropriate, but because they revealed a level of understanding I hadn't expected. Jennifer had clearly thought deeply about the dynamics that had shaped our family, had recognized the courage it had taken to break a pattern that had been destroying my spirit. "It was the hardest thing I'd ever done," I admitted, pausing in my dishwashing to meet her gaze. "But also the most necessary. I spent so many years thinking that keeping the peace was the same thing as being loving. I had to learn that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior." She nodded thoughtfully, and I could see her processing my words in the context of her own relationship with Marcus. "He's different now than when I first met him," she said. "More confident, more willing to speak up when something bothers him. I think watching you find your voice helped him find his." The insight was profound and deeply gratifying. I'd worried that my confrontation with Brittany might damage Marcus permanently, might teach him that family relationships were inherently fraught and dangerous. Instead, it seemed to have shown him what healthy boundaries looked like in action, had given him permission to expect better treatment in his own relationships. As the evening wound down and our guests began to leave, I felt that familiar sense of satisfaction that comes from a gathering well-hosted and deeply enjoyed. But this satisfaction was different from the desperate relief I used to feel when events passed without major incident. This was the contentment that comes from authentic connection, from being surrounded by people who see and appreciate your true self. Emma and David were the last to leave, lingering in the doorway for one of those extended goodbye conversations that families are famous for. As they finally drove away, waving through the car windows, I felt a surge of optimism about their future together. They had what Marcus's first marriage had lacked: mutual respect, genuine compatibility, and the kind of shared values that would see them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Robert and I finished cleaning up in comfortable silence, moving around each other with the practiced ease of a couple who had weathered storms together and emerged stronger. As we turned off the lights and headed upstairs, he slipped his arm around my waist in a gesture so familiar it was like breathing. "Good evening," he said simply, and I knew he meant more than just the success of tonight's gathering. He was acknowledging the long journey we'd traveled together, the difficult decisions that had brought us to this place of peace and authenticity. Lying in bed that night, I reflected on how profoundly my life had changed since that terrible Thanksgiving. 2 years ago, the woman who had trembled with that carving knife in her hand, who had absorbed cruel words like physical blows, felt like a character from someone else's story. In her place was someone I barely recognized but deeply respected, a woman who knew her own worth and wasn't afraid to insist that others recognize it too. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. There had been lonely periods when I'd questioned whether standing up for myself was worth the cost of family harmony. There had been moments of doubt when I'd wondered if I was being too rigid, too unforgiving, too demanding. But each time I'd wavered, I'd remembered Brittany's face at that dinner table, the satisfaction she'd taken in my pain. And I'd found the strength to maintain my boundaries. The most surprising discovery had been how much energy I'd been wasting on managing other people's emotions and reactions. For years, I'd exhausted myself trying to anticipate what might upset someone, carefully curating my words and actions to avoid conflict. Learning to show up authentically, to let other people be responsible for their own feelings, had freed up enormous amounts of mental and emotional energy that I could now channel into activities and relationships that actually nourished me. My relationship with Marcus had emerged stronger from the crisis, built on a foundation of honesty rather than the careful pretense that had characterized our interactions during his marriage to Brittany. We could now talk openly about difficult topics, could disagree without fear of catastrophic consequences, could express our feelings without worrying about managing each other's reactions. The authenticity was sometimes uncomfortable, but it was also deeply liberating. Emma had been affected by the changes too, though perhaps not in ways she'd initially anticipated. Watching me learn to set boundaries had given her permission to examine her own relationships more critically, to expect better treatment from friends and romantic partners. She'd ended a friendship that had been consistently draining and one-sided, and had begun speaking up more assertively at work when colleagues tried to take advantage of her naturally helpful nature. The ripple effects extended beyond my immediate family. Sarah had mentioned that watching my transformation had inspired her to have some difficult conversations with her own adult children about behaviors she'd been tolerating for too long. My sister Margaret had ended a toxic friendship that had been dragging her down for years. Even colleagues at the church where I volunteered had noticed changes in how I interacted with people who tried to push boundaries or take advantage of my willingness to help. It seemed that learning to value myself had given other people permission to value themselves too. By refusing to accept unacceptable treatment, I'd modeled a different way of being in the world, one that prioritized authenticity and self-respect over the false peace that comes from avoiding necessary conflicts. The holidays that followed were markedly different from those that had come before. Christmas was relaxed and joyful, filled with the kind of easy warmth that comes from being surrounded by people who genuinely care about each other. Easter brought together a slightly larger group, including some of Marcus and Jennifer's friends, and I marveled at how natural it felt to welcome new people into our family circle when they came with good intentions and open hearts. My birthday celebration in May was particularly meaningful, not because of any elaborate planning, but because of the profound sense of gratitude I felt for the life I'd built from the ashes of my former people-pleasing existence. The guests that night were people who had supported me through my transformation, who had celebrated my journey toward self-respect, who valued me for who I was rather than what I could do for them. As summer approached, Marcus and Jennifer announced their engagement, and I felt only joy at the news. There was no anxiety about whether she would fit into our family, no worry about navigating complex emotional dynamics, no fear that another wedding would bring fresh opportunities for conflict and drama. Jennifer had already proven herself to be exactly the kind of person who enhanced rather than diminished family relationships. Planning their engagement party gave me the opportunity to put my new understanding of hosting into practice. Instead of obsessing over every detail in an attempt to achieve impossible perfection, I focused on creating an atmosphere where people could connect authentically with each other. The result was a celebration that felt genuinely joyful rather than performatively perfect, the kind of gathering where conversations flowed naturally and laughter came easily. The contrast with Marcus's first engagement party was striking and painful to remember. That event had been overshadowed by Brittany's subtle criticisms and barely concealed contempt for our family traditions. Every interaction had felt fraught, with potential for conflict, every conversation carefully monitored to avoid topics that might trigger her negativity. The difference between the two celebrations was a perfect illustration of how toxic relationships can poison even the happiest occasions. As fall arrived again, bringing with it the anniversary of that transformative Thanksgiving, I found myself reflecting on the lessons I'd learned through 2 years of living with clear boundaries and high standards for how I expected to be treated. The most important discovery had been that standing up for yourself doesn't make you selfish or difficult. It makes you authentic and ultimately more loving. because you're no longer depleted by relationships that drain rather than nourish you. I'd also learned that real love doesn't require you to accept mistreatment or make yourself smaller to accommodate other people's inadequacies. Healthy relationships are characterized by mutual respect, genuine care for each other's well-being, and the kind of emotional safety that allows both people to show up as their authentic selves. Anything less than that isn't love. It's just familiarity disguised as affection. Perhaps most importantly, I'd discovered that peace isn't the absence of conflict. It's the presence of respect. The false harmony I'd tried so hard to maintain, by accepting unacceptable behavior, had actually been a form of chaos, keeping everyone walking on eggshells and preventing genuine intimacy from developing. Real peace came from creating environments where people could be honest with each other without fear of retaliation or manipulation. The woman I'd become was someone I genuinely respected and enjoyed being. She wasn't perfect, but she was honest. She wasn't always comfortable, but she was authentic. She didn't please everyone, but she no longer exhausted herself trying to. Most importantly, she had learned to distinguish between her responsibility to be kind and respectful to others and her complete lack of responsibility for managing their emotions or reactions. This new version of myself had better friendships, built on mutual enjoyment rather than one-sided caretaking. She had a stronger marriage, characterized by honesty rather than careful management of each other's feelings. She had more meaningful relationships with her children, based on respect rather than guilt or obligation. Every area of her life had improved once she'd learned to value herself enough to insist that others value her too. Looking ahead to future holidays and family gatherings, I felt only excitement rather than the dread that had once consumed me for weeks in advance. I knew that the people who would gather around my table would be there because they wanted to be, not because they felt obligated or because they saw our gatherings as opportunities to score points or settle grudges. The difference was transformative, creating space for the kind of authentic connection that makes family relationships worth the effort they require. The journey from victim to empowered woman hadn't been easy, but it had been absolutely necessary. Every moment of discomfort, every difficult conversation, every fear about whether I was being too demanding had been worth it for the peace and authenticity I'd gained. I would never again be the woman who apologized for other people's cruelty, who made excuses for inexcusable behavior, who sacrificed her own dignity in the hope of maintaining false harmony. That terrible Thanksgiving 2 years ago had been the worst and best thing that had ever happened to me. Worst because it had forced me to confront the reality of how badly I'd been allowing myself to be treated. Best because it had been the catalyst for becoming the woman I was always meant to be. Strong, authentic, unafraid to take up space in her own life. Standing in my kitchen on this beautiful autumn morning, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and relationships built on mutual respect, I felt a gratitude so profound it brought tears to my eyes. I'd learned that sometimes the most revolutionary act a woman can perform is simply refusing to accept unacceptable treatment. That lesson had changed everything, and I would spend the rest of my life grateful for the courage to finally put it into practice. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.